12 million people. 12 million, torn from this continent, loaded onto ships, carried across an ocean that had no mercy, to places that had even less. For 200 years, the slave trade moved human beings like cargo. Mothers, fathers, kings, priests, farmers, warriors, stripped of their names, their languages, their gods, their children. Most never came back, but some did. And what they found when they returned was more complicated than any of them imagined. This is the story of the ones who made it home, and what home cost them. (1787), London, a city full of black men and women, many of them former slaves, living in poverty on the streets of the world's most powerful empire. The British government had a solution: send them back to Africa. They called it the Province of Freedom. 400 men and women boarded 3 ships, the Atlantic, the Belisarius, the Vernon, and sailed for Sierra Leone. They arrived on the 10th of May, 1787. Sick, underfunded, unwelcome. Within 2 years, their first settlement was burned to the ground by the local Temne chief, King Jimmy, who had never agreed to sell his land. They built again. In 1792, 1,906 black loyalists arrived from Nova Scotia, former slaves who had fought for the British during the American Revolution in exchange for their freedom. Britain promised them land. Britain promised them equality. Britain gave them frozen winters, racial violence, and broken contracts. So they crossed the Atlantic again, this time going east. On the 11th of March, 1792, under the great cotton tree on a Sierra Leonean hillside, they gathered and sang hymns in the rain, on the soil of a continent most of them had never seen, and they named their city Freetown. 8 years later, the Jamaican Maroons arrived, warriors who had fought the British to a standstill in the mountains of Jamaica, exiled to Nova Scotia as punishment, then shipped to Sierra Leone. 3 waves of people, 3 different journeys, 1 city. But the Province of Freedom was never truly free. The British controlled it. The land rights were disputed. The promises were broken. And the very same Royal Navy that brought them here was still running slave ships from the coast just miles away. Freetown was built on a contradiction, and it knew it. But something remarkable happened inside that contradiction. The liberated Africans passing through Freetown, intercepted from slave ships mid-ocean by the British Navy, began to build something. Schools, churches, a college. Fora Bay College, founded in 1827, became the first university in sub-Saharan Africa. The Yoruba men and women among them, kidnapped from what is now southwestern Nigeria, began to educate themselves. And then they began to sail home. They called themselves the Saro. They arrived in Lagos in the 1840s, strangers speaking English and Yoruba both, wearing Western clothes, carrying Bibles in one hand and legal documents in the other. Lagos had never seen anything like them. The indigenous Lagosians called them returnees. The British called them useful. The Saro called themselves home. They built churches. They built schools. They became lawyers, doctors, merchants, journalists. They published Lagos's first newspaper. They built the infrastructure of a modern city on the bones of an ancient one. The man who first evangelized the Niger River, Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, was Saro, kidnapped into slavery as a boy, rescued by the British Navy, educated in Sierra Leone, then ordained as the first African bishop of the Anglican Church. He sailed back up the same river his kidnappers had taken him down, and preached in the language they had tried to take from him. The Saro were strangers in the land of their ancestors, and they built it anyway. But the Saro were not the only ones coming home. From the other side of the Atlantic, another group was making the crossing. In 1835, Muslim slaves in the city of Bahia, Brazil, staged an uprising, the Male Revolt. It failed. The Brazilian authorities responded by deporting the ringleaders back to Africa. What followed was a slow, decades-long migration of formerly enslaved Yoruba people, sailing from Bahia, from Pernambuco, from Cuba, back to the West African coast. They were called the Aguda. They arrived in Lagos carrying everything Brazil had given them: Portuguese names, the Catholic faith, carnival traditions, feijoada, and an architectural style unlike anything West Africa had ever seen. Grand Brazilian mansions, painted white and ochre, rose on Lagos Island. Two-story houses with ornate facades, iron balconies, and tiled courtyards, built by men and women who had been enslaved on the land of their ancestors. They named their neighborhood Popo Aguda, the Brazilian Quarter. And for generations, every Easter, every Christmas, every New Year, they held carnival in the streets of Lagos. Brazilian music, African soil. One man, Hermenegildo Gaspar da Silva, had been a prince of the Oyo Empire, sold into slavery, taken to Brazil. He gained his freedom, built a business, raised a family, and at 66 years old, sailed back to Nigeria. He bought land, built a house in the Brazilian style, and died on the soil where his story had begun. The Aguda were not quite African, not quite Brazilian, not quite anything the world had a word for. They were something new, born from the worst thing human beings have ever done to each other, and they were breathtaking. In 1961, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual, packed his belongings, renounced his American citizenship, and moved to Ghana. He was 93 years old. He died there 2 years later, never going back. In 2019, Ghana's president declared the year of return. 400 years after the first slave ships left these shores, African Americans arrived by the thousands. Some wept when they landed. Some went to the slave forts at Cape Coast and stood in the door of no return, and walked back through it, in the other direction. Some stayed. Some built businesses. Some found, as the Saro and the Aguda had found before them, that home is more complicated than a feeling, that a continent stolen from is not the same as a continent waiting, that belonging is not inherited, it is built, slowly, painfully, beautifully. 12 million people were taken from this continent. Some came back. They came back speaking Portuguese. They came back hymns in the rain. They came back as strangers to the land of their grandmothers. They came back with Brazilian architecture and Yoruba memories and Nova Scotian winters still in their bones. And they built, on every coast, in every language they had left with, and every language they had been forced to learn. They built, because that is what you do when you finally make it home.